Hello everyone. In the previous episode we took a high-level look at the economics of Europa Universalis 4. Here we're going to look a little bit deeper into the three main areas: tax, production and trade. So let's start by checking out tax. As previously stated, there isn't that much that you can really do with taxation. Each province has its basic tax rate, which you can see here, and here, and here. Tax rate is also an indicator of the size of a province. So for example, Constantinople, containing the city of Constantinople, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, has a basic tax rate of 11. Well, base tax rate of 9, modified up to 11 thanks to the presence of a capital city. Well, on the other hand, Burgas here only has a base tax of 5, but also has problems with income tax efficiency, which we'll look at in just a moment. But suffice to say, every province has a base tax which then has modifiers stacked on top of it. These modifiers can be affected using different buildings and different circumstances. In addition to the tax rate, there is also the tax efficiency that we mentioned earlier. Now, it doesn't matter how much tax people in theory owe you. If your collecting operations are crap, if you're letting people through the nets, then you're not going to get much money. If somebody can explain this theory to David Cameron, I would be very, very grateful. Tax efficiency is also modified by a range of factors, such as your nation's stability and the presence of cities or cores and naval blockades as well. So if we check here on stability, we'll see that there's no bonuses or penalties. But if we are to go to the stability, and if we check here, we can see that if there was a positive rank put in, we would see that the national tax modifier would become to plus 10%. Finally, as I've explained before, tax is a measure of the province's size. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's an indicator of how complex the area is. Areas with high tax tend to have complicated infrastructure, their own strong internal economies, lots of administrative buildings, so on and so forth. This basically means that if you take high tax areas during war, then they're going to overextend you a lot more than taking provinces with a lower base tax. So when you're planning warfare, which we'll come to, you need to be aware of the fact that you may not be able to take all of the territories you want. It may be easier to seize lots of smaller territories and build them up than seize one large territory. Taking capital cities is an especially dangerous prospect, as that can cause a lot of overextension. Overextension, as you'll remember, is a modifier on your stability, and when you are overextended you gain revolt risks, reduced tax efficiency, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's move on to production. Production is a measure of how many goods are produced within your province. It essentially is, in theory, quite similar to how trade works in the larger trade nodes, but it's all based on the local stuff. It represents local growers and manufacturers and miners and loggers creating all their goods and then trading them internally, and the wealth that comes from that, whereas trade represents trade between much larger regions. But the basic principles are still the same, and there is a considerable amount of conceptual overlap between the two. But anyway, it's a little bit more complicated than taxation. Every province produces a certain type of good. If you click the province, you can see down here in the bottom right hand corner of the province screen which good that is. Edirne, 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 by now you should know I can't pronounce these names, produces grain, whereas Izmir produces wine, Menteis produces cloth, and so on and so forth. Salt here produced in Konya. There are many different trade goods and each have a different trade value. So how does this tie into production? Well, the first thing is it ties into how many goods are produced, and this again ties into a number of factors such as the basic tax rate, buildings present, revolt risk, and so on. Constructing manufactories relevant to the different goods, so for example constructing a farming estate in an area where you have grain will improve your output of grain. If an area has a high risk of rebellion, well, there's less production because people are a little bit busier with other concerns. The more of a good you produce, however, the lower the value of that good becomes. However, this tends to be offset by the fact that you are increasing more of the good. So you're lowering the unit price, but that's more than compensated for by you shifting a larger amount of units. you can see the supply and demand calculations by hovering over the item here. The number of goods produced multiplied by the unit price plus modifiers becomes the province's trade value. The trade value you can see here. So currently, because goods being produced are quite low, the trade value here is pretty damn low at 1.23. Whereas if we check Constantinople, you can see the trade value is 1.58 with bonuses from the goods produced there. In Izmir, trade value is 3.36 because of goods produced, and another few factors as well, which we'll get to in just a moment. So what is this trade value? Trade value is how much value that province adds to the trade node that it is a part of. So for example, here in the trade map mode, we can see that Izmir is a part of the Constantinople trade node, and the total wealth within the Constantinople trade node can be seen in the screen here, as we've covered before. Izmir contributes 3.59% of that value to that node. So if you're able to increase a province's trade value, that means that you increase the amount of money that's available within that node. And I'm sure you're starting to put 2 and 2 together and see the possible benefits of that. But we'll go into that in more detail in a moment when we cover full-blown trade. But we're talking about production, not trade. So going back to how you get money from this pure production without needing to muck about with the trade system, your income from that province is simply its trade value multiplied by your production efficiency. So you can see here in production we have the trade value of 3.59, which we've got from here. That's then multiplied by production efficiency of plus 10%, and from an extra bonus in technology of plus 10% as well, for a grand total of 3.59 gold per year. And that is just there through existing. It doesn't need to go through the trade network, it doesn't need to be collected, the province simply generates that each year. Combine that with Izmir's tax, and Izmir is quite a profitable province to hold, generating 11.95 gold a year, or almost 1 gold per month. So you can improve production in a number of ways. The first thing is to improve the trade value, as we've discussed, and the best way to improve trade value is to increase the goods produced. However, you can also improve your production efficiency, and that's modified by a variety of factors, such as national ideas, government types, boosted at certain administrative technology levels, and in general it's a lot easier to increase the value of a province than it is to improve its efficiency. So that means it's generally easier to build manufactories and warehouses than it is to try and improve your production efficiency. That said, when you do improve your production efficiency, it tends to be on the national level, random events notwithstanding. This means that improving your production efficiency can potentially give you huge rewards. Unfortunately, as I've said, not the easiest thing to do. But on an aside from that, as we are talking about the province's trade value, it's worth noting that if you have a province in a trade node where you don't wield most of the trade power within that trade node, you'll get extra income from production, but on the other hand, your enemies will be getting extra income from the fact you are boosting that province's trade value, and therefore the trade value in a region that they control. So, say for example that, let's see if we have any in enemy territory. Doesn't look like we have at this point in the game, but let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we controlled Trebizond here, which we will before long, don't you worry about that. Trebizond is part of the Crimea trade node. Now if we look at the Crimea trade node, the Ottomans account for a measly 7% of the power within that node. We're not collecting from there, we're not transferring any trade power from there, so any trade that we are pumping into there, any money that we are adding into that node, we're not going to see from trade. And that's something to consider. And it means that generally speaking, you should focus on improving production and trade within territories that you already have considerable trade power within. So in this case, if it's a choice between building a warehouse here in Trebizond or a warehouse here in Ankara, we would go straight for Ankara. That said, perhaps Trebizond will have a higher trade value already. It doesn't. So Ankara makes most sense. It has a higher basic trade value, meaning it will be increased more by a percentage increase. But if Trebizond had the higher trade value, we get more money from production, but unfortunately the people who have the most power within the Crimea, which at the moment is the Crimea, would benefit from the extra trade that was being produced. So, just to recap before we go into the final leg of this trip, which is trade, which is the most complicated part, we have tax and we have production. Every province has a basic tax. This tax is then modified depending on your income tax efficiency, whether or not there's cities present, whether or not the area is a core. There are many, many factors that go into it, and by hovering over tax you can see what those are. You can't really do that much with tax. If a province has a city in it, it has a city in it. You can't build them or get rid of them. You can, however, build improvements such as temples, which will provide you with a higher rate of tax, and you can improve your stability, which will improve your tax efficiency and improve your tax income. That said, don't write off tax as unimportant. Tax is important. Tax is one of the basic, most reliable forms of income that you can get. Production can be quite easily disrupted by market prices, and trade can be heavily disrupted just by the arrival of a few ships from an enemy power. So be careful with that one. Finally, you can check the base tax value here, and the actual tax value when modified is here. There aren't really any modifications going on here, but we can see here in Adern, and I'll get there eventually, that there are modifiers going on here which are actually increasing but also significantly decreasing, intolerance being the religion problem here. So then production. Production is a function of your trade value, and your trade value is a function of the value of the goods that your province is producing and the amount of the goods they are producing. Generally speaking, not worth worrying too much about the unit price of the goods. Just try to push up production. So if you increase trade value, and if you're able to increase production efficiency, you will gain production output from that province. Okay, let's move on to trade. We covered the basics of how trade works in the previous video, so now let's look at it in a bit more detail. In any given trade node, a country will have a degree of trade power. Trade power comes from owning provinces within that region, sending merchants into the node, and using your ships to protect trade in that area, and having capital cities within that trade zone. This can be further modified in a few ways, such as random events and your nation's mercantilism score. So for example, here in Constantinople, you can see the Ottomans wield 26% of trade power. Looking at this chart down here, you can see where that power comes from. So for example, 24 units of our power comes from the provinces that we control. We get an extra 6.3% bonus to that trade power thanks to our prestige and our trade efficiency rating. This brings us up to a total of 32.9%. So let's send some ships to boost that. We have a navy here consisting of 3 light ships and another one consisting of 7 galleys. Let's send those light ships to protect trade in Constantinople and boost our power. All you need to do is select the relevant navy, tell it to protect trade, and then select the trade node that you want it to do that within. You can conveniently see here from these icons what your merchants are doing in each trade node. So you can see here in Alexandria we are currently transferring trade power, whereas in Constantinople we are protecting it. So let's send them to Constantinople. We'll unpause the game. And after a little bit of time has passed, you can see we are now gaining 9 trade power from the fact that our ships are protecting trade in that area. And you can see that's a significant increase up to 31%. Mercantilism score can be found here within the trade. Trade efficiency gives you bonuses to your income. Trade range is how far you can send your merchants. So for example, until you've improved that, you wouldn't be able to send merchants all the way over to, for example, Bordeaux or even the New World when it's discovered. Trade steering is how good you are at actually steering trade. So for example, if we increase that percentage, then our merchant here in Alexandria will send more money up the way towards Constantinople. Trade income, as you can see here, gives you a bonus to the income from your trade, and mercantilism gives you a bonus to the provincial trade power and that is the amount of power that you are generating from simply owning provinces within that trade node. So how does this all work then? Well, all the trade power is totaled up and divided into two percentage groups, those who want the trade moved forward and those who want the trade collected. These percentages are then applied to the total value of the trade node, the total value of the trade node being the money coming into it and the money being generated locally. So let's take an example. Let's say this trade node, Constantinople, is worth exactly 100 gold. Now, 30% of the trade power present within that node is being devoted to collection, and the remaining 70% is being directed towards moving the trade on. That would mean that 30 gold is being collected and 70 gold is being moved on. Doesn't matter the countries, what matters is the total percentage of the trade power being devoted to one of these two actions. So next, all the nations that want the gold moved on have all of their trade power totaled up and divided into percentages as well. So if two nations want trade moving and nation A contributed 20% of the total trade power that made up all of the nations that wanted the gold moved on, and nation B contributes the other 80%, then 56 gold, which is 80% of the 70 gold that was being moved on, goes wherever nation B wants it to go. The remaining gold, 14, goes wherever nation A wants it to go. Now, this means that if there are already a large number of merchants moving gold in the direction that you want it to go, it might not be worth sending a merchant to steer trade at all unless you'd be able to add a significant amount of percentage points to the trade power wanting the gold moved. In short, under that situation, you wouldn't be sending the merchant to actually steer the trade because all the trade is already being steered in that direction. You'd be doing it to improve the amount of gold being steered. You can get a bonus to steering equal to your trade steering score, which we have covered, and this is in turn modified by your naval tradition, which we can cover in naval warfare. And certain ideas can increase that as well, and some countries get a bonus as a national idea. Now, if only one merchant is steering trade, that means that that merchant has absolute control over where that trade is going. However, if there is only one merchant steering trade, the amount of trade power which is being used to steer trade is likely to be quite low. Generally speaking, when countries are steering trade, they do it with a merchant. So we've covered how the gold is moved on. Just to recap, all of the total trade power in the node, that is, if we go down here, the sum total of every power and all of their trade is added up. Then we take the percentage of those that want it moved forward and the percentage of those that want it kept, and the gold total value of the trade node is applied as such. So if 80% want it moved on, 80% of the value of the trade node gets moved on. It's then divided up by the percentage again, but this time on the directions. So if there's only two ways out of a trade node and 50% of the total trade power wants it to go one way and the other 50% wants it to go the other way, it will be split evenly down the middle. So what about gold retained? Well, it works in exactly the same way. Everyone contributing trade power to the collection group gets their trade power totaled up and then divided up into the percentages. So for example, let's say we have 3 powers wanting to collect trade in the continuing example from above. You have 50%, 30% and 20% out of the 30 gold collected. So then that means that the group that contributed 50% of the trade power to collection would get 15 gold, which is half of the 30 gold that's been kept. The group that contributed 30% would get 9, and the group that contributed 20% would get 6. That amount, however, can be boosted. So if we see here, the Ottomans are collecting from trade, and we're getting a total of 2.4 from that. However, we collect only 2 gold from the trade node. However, thanks to the fact that we have a merchant present, and thanks to our trade efficiency of 10%, that means it's boosted up to 2.4%. So let's have a look at this imaginary trade node from the top. The trade node is worth 100 gold. and there are 5 nations trading in it, nations A through E. Nations A and B want the trade steered. Nations C, D and E want the gold collected. Unfortunately, nations C, D and E have a relatively small amount of trade power, whereas nations A and B have a lot more trade power. This means that out of all the trade power invested in the node, only 30% of it is being used to collect, even though there are 3 nations trying to collect, as opposed to only 2 nations trying to steer. So out of the 30% trying to collect, that's applied as a straight percentage to the value of the node, meaning that 30 gold is collected. Out of the 70% of the trade power being used to steer, 70% of 100 gold is 70 gold. Once those amounts are set, the same percentages are applied again. Out of all of the trade power that was being used to steer, not all of the trade power in the node, just the trade power being used to steer, nation A contributed 20%, so it gets 14 gold, 20% of the 70. Nation B contributed 80% of the steering trade power, so they get 56 gold, which is 80% of 70. And that gold goes wherever they choose to steer on from. The remaining 3 nations only get 30 gold to share between them because they only contributed 30% of the total trade power in the node which was being used to collect. However, out of that 30% that was contributed to the total power, Nation C contributed 50%, which means they get a base rate of 15 gold, 50% of 30. Nation D gets 30%, which is 9 gold, 30% of 30, and Nation E gets 20% of 30, 6 gold. It's just a question of applying the percentages and then applying the percentages to those sub-percentage groups. So what's the basic strategy here with trade? Well, ideally you want to ensure that you increase your trade power in a node before anything else. Without sufficient trade power, you're only going to collect a pittance, and if you're steering trade, you're not going to be able to steer much of it in the direction you want to go. So the first things first is, if you want to play the trade game in a trade node, ensure that you do everything you can to get a high level of trade power within that node first. Once you've solidified your hold on a node by obtaining a large amount of trade power, start collecting from the node where you have the highest trade power, and then start building up your power in other nodes to steer trade from those nodes into your primary node. For the Ottomans, we already have a significant amount of power in Constantinople, so that's our primary and that's where we're going to collect. Our next goal should be further building our trade power here in Constantinople to squeeze out the competition, and then building trade power in the nodes next to Constantinople. Alexandria and Crimea are very good targets. Ragusa can work, however you're starting to nudge into Western Europe there, and Western Europe has better armies than you, so that's a risky move. So let's end on a few points. If you have a solid power base in more than one node, it might not even be worth steering. You might just want to get all of the money that you can from those nodes through collection. So if we have 2 merchants, and we have a huge amount of trade power in Constantinople, and we've conquered all of the trade power in Crimea, well, we might as well collect from the Crimea and from Constantinople, because there's no point in steering it when we could be collecting it. Generally speaking, the idea of using trade offensively to steer trade away from someone who wants to collect it doesn't really work. If you have enough power to really make a difference, then you might as well be collecting from that node, as you'll be milking the money from them anyway. If you want to hurt your enemy's trade, you do it by boosting your own trade power in their nodes. You don't do it by changing your trade tactics or trying to take anything away from them. It's a straightforward boost your trade power. Speaking of offensive trade tactics though, we should take a look at embargoes. So, what's an embargo? Well, an embargo can be issued against any nation with which you share power in a trade node. It's diplomatic action, as you can see here, and if you take it, then it has the following effects. The country that you're using it on takes a hit to its trade power in all the nodes that you share equal to half of your trade power within that node. Now that can be further modified by ideas. So let's say, for example, we were going to issue this trade against the Mamluks. We'd first of all need to identify which nodes we both have power in, and in this case I can tell you straight off the bat, it's Alexandria. If we look at the political map mode, we can see that they own the territory. However, we have a merchant in Alexandria which gives us some trade power. It's a tiny amount of trade power, but it's still trade power. So if we look here, we can see our trade power is a mighty 2.1. Half of that is 1, and that would mean the Mamluks are reduced to a paltry 57.5 trade power in that node, demolishing their huge percentage of 41% down to maybe 40.5% if we were really lucky. Actually, it probably wouldn't have an impact on it at all. So you can see straight away that issuing an embargo against the Mamluks is going to have virtually no bonuses to us at all. But is it worth doing anyway? Well, the answer is, generally speaking, no. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, whoever you're using against gets an opinion penalty on you, which can be problematic, and more importantly, they get a casus belli. Don't forget that they get the casus belli. Now, in addition to this, you also take a -5 penalty to your trade efficiency, and this in turn reduces your trade income bonus and means that you get less money. So essentially, we're doing virtually nothing to them, but they get a casus belli against us, they get an opinion penalty against us, oh, and we're crippling our own trade throughout our trade empire by doing it. There is an exception to this last rule though. If your enemy is a rival, as indicated here in their diplomatic options, which we will cover in a couple of episodes' time, you don't take that penalty. This means that you only need to worry about the fact that they get a casus belli against you. So in this case, yeah, we might as well issue an embargo against the Mamluks. I know that our military is strong enough to actually repel an attack by them, and hey, that one measly little one is still something. But that means that the basic principle is simply don't embargo someone unless you're their rival, or you can take them in a war, or you already have a significant amount of power within their trade nodes. If our territory, or should I say when our territory starts creeping down through this area and we start taking sizable chunks in the Alexandria trade node, well then an embargo will be a lot more effective because we have a lot more trade power to levy against their trade power. But for now, we don't really want to risk pissing them off. Anyway, that covers the economy of Europa Universalis 4 in a bit more detail. We should now know our tax. Tax is basically a flat rate that you can see here, which is modified by various factors within the province. We have production. Production is the value of your goods multiplied by the current market price of those goods, with any bonuses applied for production efficiency. These two figures combined, tax and production, give you the total income for that province. And finally, there is trade. All you really need to remember about trade in terms of the formulas is it all boils down to percentages. So hopefully that will help, and next week we will be looking at warfare, the good stuff. But for now, I'm Evis T, signing off. As previously discussed, and we will discuss in more detail later on, this means that the more money there is in the